Hello everyone, welcome to the second video in this series on building Next.js apps. If you missed the first video, the first video we talked about setting up your project architecture. So we set up, installed Next.js, we set up Storybook, we configured our linters, our commit hooks, code formatters, all the stuff that you want to set up to have a good baseline to build your project on top of. And we built a sample component, but we didn't really do anything in terms of building an actual application. So that's where this video picks up. So if you haven't seen the first video and you're interested in that kind of stuff, I would really recommend you start there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to begin the work that we do today at the end of where we left off in the last video. I'll provide you with a specific commit, a commit hash that you can check out from the repository to get to the same state that I'm starting from in this video. If you do want to start from scratch, you probably could. What you would want to do would to be at least set up a Next.js TypeScript project with Create Next App and add Storybook on top of it. Then you would be pretty close to where we're starting here, just without all the nice to have configuration options for the environment. But functionally, you'd be at about the same spot. So we'll begin by talking about what we're going to do in this video. So we're going to build an actual full stack application. It's still going to be pretty basic. We're not getting into, it's way too much to get into every aspect of it. Some things will come in later videos, but we're going to at least build ourselves a nice front end. We're going to have a little back end with some API routes, Next API routes. We'll talk about those. We'll talk about static pages versus dynamic pages, get server-side props versus get static props. We'll get into styling. So in this video, we're going to use TailwindCSS, which is really popular right now. A lot of companies are looking for Tailwind skills, so that's a really good one to have. Some people are not into Tailwind, and that's perfectly okay. If you don't want to use Tailwind, the project is already set up to use CSS modules as well, so you could follow along writing pure CSS and still do the same things that we do. And lastly, the other thing this video is going to touch on a little bit is just the general thought process around software development, particularly web development in general. So we're not just going to jump in and start writing code whenever we think of something. We're going to talk about like, what kind of app exactly are we trying to build? What are the requirements for the app? Scope it out, figure out what the minimum, what they call MVP, the minimum viable product is for the goal that we're trying to reach. So the goal that we're trying to reach with this video is to teach you, the viewers, how to build an app in Next.js. So my goal is to build kind of the smallest app that introduces all of the different concepts that I want to talk about without repeating myself too many times. From that point, you could take it from there. So that's pretty much the scope of this video. So that's where we're going to start from today. So the first thing that I'm going to do before anything else is I'm going to zoom in, because on my last video I forgot to do that, and people made some good points that it was difficult to follow along sometimes. So get real big. That looks pretty good. Should be able to see that. And then the next thing that I'm going to do, so I've already gone ahead and written, prepared this project. I know what we're going to build, but I'm going to check out a commit that puts me in the same place where I left off at the end of the last video with the basic project template and all the configurations. So you'll be able to get that commit hash from the video description, and I'm just going to copy it now. So I'm going to git checkout. Again, you don't need to see this in the video because you can copy it from the video description. It's just a particular commit in this project, so I can start over again, and then I'm just going to make a new branch just for the sake of this video. So git branch next app video tutorial, and I'm going to check out that branch. Okay, So now we'll be able to work on this project and build this project, and you can follow along from here. So the very first thing that we need to do is to configure Tailwind. And I believe that right now is the only thing that I actually did add in advance. But I'll go through every step of the process so you can get it in there as well and understand what's going on. So what is Tailwind? There's the first question. Tailwind is... go to the website and read how they describe it. But Tailwind is a collection of utility classes that are mapped directly to CSS. If you've used something like Bootstrap before, similar to that in a number of ways. But it's basically meant to be a very lightweight, quick and easy way to get some consistent styles into your app. By design, it puts those styles as classes on your components, so your styles and your components are coupled really well together. In terms of global styles for how your overall app looks, Tailwind supports themes, and we're going to get into that too. So you basically configure how you want, colors, typography, spacing, things like that. You can configure at the theme level, and then you can use your utility classes to pick up from that theme anywhere in your application. So it's really, really clean. It's really, really nice, wonderful to work with. And one of the really nice things about it is that you use a post-CSS compiler to basically analyze your whole project, and it will strip out all the CSS that Tailwind provides that your specific project doesn't actually use. So if you install Tailwind and all you do is use a couple of flex classes or colors, then Tailwind will strip out all the rest of the CSS that you're not using. So it ends up being a very lightweight part of your bundle. So all of that said, let's begin by adding Tailwind to our project. So the very first thing that we need to do is install it. So if you remember from the last video, we've been using Yarn. So I'm going to do that now. I'm going to type, I need to address the fact that my little video square is overwriting a lot of my text. One moment. All right, I got myself a little bit shorter terminal there, so you'll be able to see the full commands. So we're going to yarn add development dependencies, everything in Tailwind. The Tailwind compiler will strip off everything you don't need, but you don't need it as part of your runtime. So we need Tailwind CSS. We need post CSS to handle the CSS compiling, and auto prefixer handles things like browser support. So if you are using CSS and you use a particular property, it'll automatically add, like the -- WebKit -- Microsoft versions of those properties, so that you get better support in older browsers. So those are the three packages that we're going to add. And then next, we need to initialize Tailwind. So to do that, we do npx Tailwind CSS init -p. Already exists for me, but for you, it won't already exist. So what that's going to do is it's automatically going to create a file called postcss.config.js. And then you will also need to create a file called tailwind.config.js. And we're going to edit those now. So not much going on in post-CSS. This is just a default configuration for your post-CSS package. What we want to do is we want to get into tailwind.config.js. And I'm going to paste this here. Again, remember, this is there is a repository that'll be in the video description, and there's a written version of this tutorial where you can copy code from, also in the video description, so you don't need to worry too much about trying to type everything out quickly and keeping up. So in my Tailwind configuration .config.js is going to look like this. The content that I want it to process is in my pages and components directory. So we also have a couple of other directories that are going to be for backend stuff, but we don't want Tailwind to work on those. There's no point in scanning all those directories, because the only place we're going to be putting CSS and classes obviously is in the front end. And then secondly, what I've done here is I've started setting up my theme, and I'm setting my breakpoints. So what this will do is whenever you use the Tailwind's breakpoint terms like XS, SM, MD for device sizes, it'll specifically refer to these breakpoints that you set here. And I have aligned those with the ones that we set in the last video in Storybook. So if I go to my Storybook configuration and I look at Preview.js, you'll notice that the breakpoints that I'm using here are the same as the breakpoints in Tailwind. So when I put Tailwind, when I use Tailwind classes and I go and test them in Storybook, I'll be able to see the styles change at exactly the same points as the templates, the breakpoint templates that I have in Storybook, which is a really nice development experience. So that's the basics for our Tailwind config, and we can move on from there. So just before I test the app, there's one last bit of configuration I need to do. We need to have we need to set all of the base Tailwind styles, all the CSS that Tailwind actually uses to map the classes to the CSS. So we can do that in our globals.css file, which I've put here inside the pages directory in our next project. You can see I've already got it here, but this is what you need to paste: @Tailwind base, @Tailwind components, and @Tailwind utilities. And that's going to set up all of the CSS that your classes pick up for you. So with that done, I'm now going to say yarn dev, and this is going to start our dev server on port 3000. If I look at package.json, look at our scripts, I have next dev, and the port by default is 3000. I'm going to open my browser and go to localhost 3000. And I see that I have my cat card that we created in the last video up and running here. But look at this background, and let's go and take a look at our index, our homepage here. Take a look at the class names here. This is Tailwind. So I've said background gradient to right from cyan 500 to blue 500. And as we can see here, that's exactly what it's doing. So we know that Tailwind is installed and working properly. If it wasn't, if I hadn't configured it properly, then this wouldn't be working. And if I remove these classes, I'll just remove this whole thing, then I should get no background at all. And that's what I get. So that shows me that Tailwind is set up and working properly. What shall we do next? So next we need to configure Tailwind to also work with Storybook. So for that, it takes a little bit of setting up to do, but it's not too hard. I'm going to close down my dev server. I'm going to take a look at my Storybook preview file here. First thing I need to do is I need to import that global CSS file with Tailwind into my preview.js file in the Storybook configuration directory. So this will set up Tailwind styles for Storybook, but in order to process them, use those @directives here, I need to make sure Storybook is also configured for post CSS, the same way that we did in our main project. So when I go to main.js, I see that I need to add a package called Storybook add-on post CSS. So yarn add as a development dependency. Oh, I already had yarn add in there. This is not going well. Okay, let's hold on there. Just yarn add Storybook add-on post CSS. Hit enter there. If you're using CSS modules, you've also got this one. Since I have it in here, I'm going to add it as well. If you're not using CSS modules, then you don't need to add this plugin, and you don't need to have this line right here. But everything below that, all of this is what's going to get, oh, get out of here. This is what's going to get Tailwind support working in your Storybook project. So add this into your main.js and you'll be good to go, assuming your configuration file looks the same as it did continuing on from the end of the last video. Otherwise, you can just check this, you can get this code from the repository here and copy it yourself. So with that done, what I should be able to do is run yarn Storybook and see the look of our background with the cyan gradient in Storybook as well. And that will tell us that Tailwind is working in both our project and Storybook. Oh, here it comes, popping up. Zoom in a little bit. So what I'm going to look at, since I don't have my Next.js pages in Storybook, I just have my components. I have these base templates that we created in the last video. I've added the same thing, the background gradient here, as a class to my component. So if I look at the base template component in Storybook, I should see a gradient on it. And the data will just say hello world. So I open up Storybook, I click on templates, base template, I see hello world, and we see a nice blue gradient from left to right. So Tailwind's now configured in our main project, and it's configured in Storybook, and we're ready to start building our application. So as I mentioned earlier in the video, one of the topics that we want to cover in this tutorial is the idea of planning and scoping around your web project or your software project. So we haven't even talked about what app we're making yet. So that's before we start coding it, let's decide what we're going to do. So I thought about a few different options that I could use to show you the different parts of Next.js and how they all come together. And I decided on building a really, really obviously simplified clone of Google. Just a search engine where you can type in some text and get a result back. So one of the reasons why this is a good solution is the requirements that I was looking at that I wanted to teach here was styling with Tailwind. So we can, Google's not too complex. We can show you how to use Tailwind and some basic classes to set up the look and feel of it. Routing. So we're going to have two main pages, the search page and the results page. So we'll use Next.js's built-in routes to navigate from one to the next one, and preserving state between those two pages. That's a big part of it too. We want to look at Next.js's API routes. So we're going to use API routes to retrieve the search results for us. We're not going to get as far as using a real database in this tutorial. That would be a little bit too much, but we will create we'll use just a JSON file to represent like a mock database, and we'll actually search within that JSON file for data the same way that we would within a real database, like say a NoSQL database like MongoDB, where the data comes back as JSON anyway. So you can create the same, almost the same API for querying a JSON file, and then just switch it out for a real database down the road if you like. We're going to look at the difference between static and dynamic pages. We'll talk about that more in a bit, but our home page is going to be static. Our results are going to be dynamic. And lastly, we're going to look at image optimization a little bit. There's not a lot of images. We're not going to do Google image search, but just for the logo, we'll show how you can use Next's special image element to optimize for different screen sizes. So that explains the reasoning for why we've chosen this project. And I also just covered some of the requirements that we want to be able to build. Some nice to haves that we're not going to get into for this video, but we will get into in future videos would be authentication, being able to log in and log out, internationalization, so in English, French, whatever language you like, version of each one of those pages. Next.js supports that out of the box really, really, really well. Testing, certainly. I would love to get into testing in a video probably very soon, possibly even the next one after this. And then data persistence, which would be a real database. So not going to get to those now, but those are things that we could do with even with this little project that would be really good ways to introduce those topics. So let's begin by taking a look at planning out the front end. So I'm going to just navigate to Google here. And I am Canadian, I'm in Canada, so it's going to give me the Google Canadian version. Hopefully it looks pretty similar to the one in your country. You can build whichever one that you like, just follow along with the video. So what I've got here is I've got basically what I like to do looking at this is break it down into what different pieces are would be different components in my application. So looking around, I see first functionally, I see a search bar, like a search input. So it's an input. It's got two buttons here that are taking data from the input and doing something, probably submitting a form. This looks like a form. So what I'm circling here with my mouse, I'll zoom in a little bit, I'm going to likely build as a component together. I've got a header, sticky at the top of the page here with a few buttons in it, so I'm going to have a header for sure. I got a footer, sticky at the bottom of the page with a few more buttons, tells where I am. And then aside from those components, I just have the overall layout. So I'm likely going to have a component that represents the layout of this page, which will place the header at the top, place the footer at the bottom. Maybe that'll have the logo in it. Then my input search component, and finally this little English and French toggle at the bottom of the page. Once I search, the other piece that I'm going to want, say hello. I'm going to not going to worry about all of this specific media related things. I'm really just looking at this here, these search results. So on the search page, I have the header again. It's got a little variant. You can see that the input has been embedded up into the header. Probably not going to get that fancy with our template. We'll likely just use the same header as we did before. But I have a very consistent look and function with the search results here. I have a link at the top, a title in larger text, a description of it, and some assorted other information. But link, title, description of link. Link, title, description of link. So that, without question, what I'm circling here is going to be a component, and I'm probably going to call that something like search result view or something along those lines. Cool. So that gives us a place to start with. If you're really, I'm not going to go through the process of drawing it out in this video, but if you're doing it yourself or for your company, I would recommend, taking images using an actual design tool, circling these things, coming up with names. If you're working with a designer, obviously you'd be using something like Figma or Adobe XD to break these out into actual components and design them first before you begin development. This is our speedy, quick version of the design and thought process to at least give us something to work towards, and we have a plan before we actually begin development. So with that said, I believe we are ready to dive into building some components. Okay, so let's begin building our search component. So this is simply the text input with a couple of buttons on it that's going to allow us to do our little Google search. So as I did with the previous video, if you remember and you watched it, I created a base template that all my components are built off of. And the reason that I did this is I get just a consistent template for the component, for the stories, and for the mock data. I also have a module.css file to go with it. If you're using CSS modules, then you can use that for your styling. If you're following along with this video like I am and using Tailwind, I'm actually just going to delete this now just to avoid any confusion, because we're going to be doing all of our styling with Tailwind. So I'm taking this base template directory, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to go to my components. Now let's decide, so what exactly is a search bar? It's not a generic thing that you're going to see in a lot of different apps, like a card or a button or a navigation or anything like that. It's a pretty specific component for this. So what I'm going to do for the time being, for lack of a better term, I'm going to create a directory in my components called utility, and these are simply going to be utility components that are specific to this app and typically have something some business logic around them as well. You could call it widgets. You could think about how your the total scope of your app, how it comes together, and you would likely in a large app certainly break these down into multiple different folders in specific domains of areas of functionality. But for what we've talked about, what we've planned for this app, I know that in the end, the only things that are really going to be in here is the search bar component and probably the search result component, which is also pretty specific to the search functionality of our app. So utility there. Then I'm going to paste the base component template that I created there. And I'm just going to call this component search. Depending on the way that I would call it search input, but it's more than just the input. It also has the buttons with it. Search widget, search, whatever you want to call it. I'm simply going to call it search. Naming things is the hardest part of the job most of the time. So I've changed the name of the directory to search. I'm also going to change the name of each one of these from base template to search. Search.mocks, rename the search component, and rename search.stories.tsx there. And then finally, I need to change base template to search in the actual code. So I'm going to right click on my new component. I'm going to say find in folder. I'm going to search for base template, match case, and I'm going to replace with the word search. So for all of my templates, for my stories, my mock data, everything that I created with the term base template is now going to be set up for search. So I don't have to rewrite any of that stuff, which is really nice. And then the only thing that I still need to do after that, because it doesn't quite follow the same rules, is the structure of my storybook. I've got utility/search here. So I'm going to do utility/search. I'm going to save that, and then I should be able to find this template component in Storybook now. Still got my Storybook open. Which one is it? Not that one. Too many windows. Don't have it open. Localhost 6006. I believe it's still running. Yes, it is. Okay. So I look down now in utility. Zoom in for you a little bit here. Search. And I have my hello world template with Tailwind styles on top of it. So we are ready to start building the structure of the template. So what is the structure of it? Let's look back at the component itself. Okay, so, it's nice that we have this live working example to work from. In the real world, you would probably, if you're lucky, not have something like this, but you would have a design provided to you in a tool like Figma or any of those design tools, hopefully, unless you yourself are the developer and designer, in which case you kind of need to plan it out, draw it out in your head before beginning to write the code. So I know that I have, forgetting about the style and how it looks, I have an input, a text input here, and I have two buttons. So let's build those. Those things. And I know that when I hit the search button, as typical, that kind of setup, an input with a search button that submits that input somewhere. Whenever you talk about something like that, you're talking about a form. So what my component is going to look like is, got it set up here, is I'm going to replace all of this, get rid of the sample stuff, and I'm going to replace it with this. So I have a form, I have an input with a type that's text. Notice I'm not getting into styling yet. I'm not getting into React state, nothing like that. I'm just start with HTML and slowly introduce the other pieces as we go. I've got a button that says Google search. It submits the form. And then I've also got another button that submits the form, and it's called I'm feeling lucky. And if you're wondering what this is just the apostrophe escape character for HTML text. So, and then that's it. I'm going to save that. And let's go and take a look at our storybook. Oh, I shouldn't have clicked on that. I don't want to submit any forms yet. So I don't see much styling, and the reason that everything is really blank is because we're working on top of the base Tailwind, and we haven't put any classes on it, so it's completely empty, ready to go to style however we like. You can't really see it, but the input is actually here. This is my button with no styles, and this is my other button with no styles. So, excellent. We've got the HTML structure for a search component. Let's move on to the CSS. Okay, so what I will do, if you're new to CSS, you should do the same thing that I did, because not CSS, Tailwind. We're going to presume that you at least have a good background in CSS for this. If you don't, I wouldn't recommend even jumping right into Tailwind. If you're not already familiar with CSS, start with raw CSS and learn that first. Tailwind is basically just a way to write shorthands and speed up your styling process. But if you don't know CSS already, you're going to have a lot more trouble with Tailwind. So that said, I myself am fairly new to Tailwind. I just started using it last week for the sake of this video because I wanted to learn it. And I found the nice thing is if you already know CSS, then it really doesn't take long at all to get comfortable with Tailwind. So my process tends to be to open up the Tailwind docs, decide exactly what I want to do, and then Control F and find in the documentation for Tailwind's shorthand for doing that. So the first thing that I'm going to do, we're going to do most of the styling in this application based on Flex. You could use Grid as well if you want to. Grid pretty much has almost universal browser support now, unless you need to support really old versions of Internet Explorer or Safari. Personally, I'm a little bit more comfortable with Flexbox. I do have to support older browsers in my day job, so I use it more often. So that's what I'm going to use for this. But you could certainly use Grid for pretty much all the same things that we're going to do here with Flexbox. So I'm going to begin by making my form into a Flexbox. Now, why? I'm not just going to drop styles onto it. I'm trying to go from this to this. So what do we have here? We have the layout is in a column form. We have the input. It's the first item in the column, and then these buttons is the second item in the column. So we have one flex layout going down, input, buttons, and then the buttons themselves will also be a flex layout, which is a row, horizontal, two buttons beside each other. And we can simply use the flex gap property to put the padding in between them. So we'll begin by putting some styles on the form. So what I would do is I would say, oh, well, I know I want it to be a flex, but I don't know flex in Tailwind. Get on here. I'm just going to hit Control F, flex, Flexbox and Grid. I want flex direction. I'm going to want it to be flex column. I want it to be a display flex item. So which one would that be? Oh, that certainly would be the display property. Display. So just the word, just the word flex as a class will give me display flex, and flex column would be the same as saying flex direction column. And then there's a couple other things that we can get into, like I mentioned gap. So I search gap flow up here. Oh, click on it. Gap X 0, gap Y 0. These numbers here will be based on the pixel value that you set for the size of spacing in your theme. So you'll be able to control the value of these numbers in your theme. By default, it's set to whatever the spacing value is in your theme. And that should get us started. So I've already prepared this here. I'm going to say form, class name, flex. It's a flex column. I want the items to be centered. Again, if we look at this here, the input here and the buttons here are centered. So if this is the box, the buttons are centered in the middle of it. And I'm going to have a gap of 5, and 5 being a multiple of whatever the spacing in my theme is. Looks here by default, it's going to give me 1.25 rems. Cool. What is next? So the input itself, well, you can search these properties if you want to. I'll quickly talk about them. We want it to be rounded. We're going to give it a border of size 2. the width is going to be, now here's where we get into the breakpoints, which is interesting. The width by default is going to be 5/6 the size of its container. And where that's going to do is that's going to start on mobile. But look, as soon as we get up to the small breakpoint, remember we controlled the breakpoints in our Tailwind. So as soon as we get up to 600 pixels here, then it's going to be, the width is going to be a static 96 size. 96 being a multiple of whatever your spacing unit is on your theme. It's going to have a height of 12, and it's going to have padding on the inside of it, X padding of 3. So let's just save that as is so far and take a look at what that does for us. So this was our goal here. I'm not looking at adding in the embedded icon. Putting icons inside of inputs is, you can do it, certainly. It's just a little bit tricky and kind of beyond the scope of this video. So if I look here, we can see, oh, I've got a really nice search bar there. And if we change our Storybook breakpoint down to super small, you can see it changed the width of it. It's now 5/6 the width of the screen. That way we make sure that it doesn't, if it had a static 96, it might go all the way to the edge and that wouldn't look very good. But as soon as I jump up to small, you can see it goes to this size here, and it should stay at that size regardless of the screen size we change to. Awesome. All right. Next, we have the classes for the buttons. So what do the buttons need to look like? Let's take a look here. The buttons need to look, they've got a little bit of a gray background. They've got a border on hover. They've got black text. Our default buttons right now, they don't have that gray background, so let's get that in there. So I'm going to do the button. Class names. It's going to have no border by default. Looks like I haven't done the hover, but that's okay. You can add in the hover border if you like. Padding 2. X padding is 6. Give it a little bit more padding on the left and right. Background is slate 100, and the buttons are going to be medium rounded. And of course, I want both buttons to look the same, so I'm going to copy that and put it down here. And Tailwind supports something called the apply directive that will let me later, if I want to make just one class that has both of these in it and then be able to reuse it on different buttons, I would be able to do that. So we could get rid of this code that we copied and make our code more dry. But gets the job done for now. Let's go and take a look at our buttons. There, see? Now they're looking a lot more like the Google buttons, but they're not beside each other. So how do we do that? Let's wrap our two buttons here in a div, and that div is going to be a flex element. Well, really, the default behavior for block items is beside each other, so we don't even really need to make it flex. We can just have the two buttons beside each other with some padding in between. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a div around it, those two buttons, and just X space of 3. Let's see what that looks like. Format and save. Update Storybook. Go back. There. Look at that. Looking pretty good. Go search, and it submits to nowhere, obviously, because we haven't handled that case yet. But we have a working, functional search input. So that's really good. Let's look at how we can take these classes that we did here and put them into a single button class. If we want to use that same button all over our app with the same styles, we don't want to have to paste all of these classes everywhere. So what I do is I go to my global CSS where I set my Tailwind directives. I add another what's called a layer, and I'm going to add it to the components because buttons are components. I'm going to call it, you can call it whatever you want to here. This is a CSS class, button primary. So what does button primary do? It applies all of those same classes that we added there. So format and save. I'm updating global CSS. I might have to restart Storybook in order to pick this up, but we'll go and check. So now I can use this button primary class as a shorthand for all of these Tailwind classes and clean up my code. Highlight all of that. Control D to also highlight the next thing. and paste button primary. So cleaner, shorter code there. Save, and it should still have those slate background styles that I put on before. Go to Storybook, and it does. Excellent. So what's next? Okay. So what we want to do next is add the React state to this component so we can keep track of the search value, because we know down the road we're going to want to have access to that search value so we can actually do a search on it. Now you could just use the built-in behavior of the form and catch the search term on the back end. So that's what's called an uncontrolled component. But we're going to make this a controlled component. So we have full control of the search value, and we can do essentially anything we want with it. And you'll see why we want to do that later on in the video. So I am going to import. I presume you're already familiar with React, so I'm not going to talk too much about this. I'm going to import useState from React, the state hook. While I'm up here, this sample text prop, our search component doesn't take any props. It doesn't need any information sent to it. So I'm going to delete that from the interface, and immediately I get an error down here saying, don't forget to delete it there because I'm not using it. Auto format. And then I'm going to say, I want to state a variable that represents the search term. So I'm going to say const search term, and set search term is equal to useState, and that's going to be a string, and it's going to default to undefined here. And because I saved it and it auto formatted and it saw that I wasn't using my state import, it got rid of it for me. So I'm just gonna re-import that again. There, and now when I save, I'm using it, so it's not gonna delete it on me. Okay, so what do we do with our search term and our set search term? Once again, if you've used React before, you should be aware of this, but essentially all we need to do is control the value on our text input. So value is equal to search term, and whenever the search term or the input changes on change, now what's going to happen when it changes is it's going to send your function a reference to the event, the input event. It's not going to send it a string. So if I just say set search term, this isn't going to work, and I'm going to get an error because it's going to say that string is not the same as a change event. So what I need to do is just do a little function in here, which the onChange sends the HTML event as an argument. The event target is this input element, and I'm going to say set search term to event.target.value. So there we go. Whenever I change it, the input change event will set my search term equal to the target value. So when I save that, I've taken control of the input, and I should be able to still go and type anything that I want to into it. Good. If you hadn't set it up properly, then trying to type text here, nothing would show up. Okay, and yeah, lastly, we want to prepare our component to be able to take that search term whenever we hit the Google search button and do something with it. We haven't set up any other part of our app yet, so we don't know what we're going to do, but we know we're going to want to do something with it. And when that happens is in the onSubmit attribute of a form element. So we have a submit button in here. We have an input inside of the form. So by default, according to browser and HTML behavior, when I click a submit button in a form, it will run the onSubmit button. And by default, it will post that back to your server, and you can prevent that default behavior and do something else with it with the prevent default method. So onSubmit is equal to, similarly, you're going to get a form event here. I don't want to post to the server yet. I'm going to want to do something else with this data later. So I'm going to say e.prevent the default behavior. And whenever I submit, I want to do something with the search term. I've created a state value that has a reference to that search term in it. And I can just confirm that I have access to it by doing, for now, let's just do alert search term. So whenever I click any submit button within my form, it's going to alert me whatever I've searched for in the search bar. And we can replace this alert with actual app functionality later on when we're ready. So, hello, search, hello. Great, we have our component ready to go to connect to our app down the road. So this is a great place to save and run a commit. So I'm going to do git add all of our new code. I'm going to do git commit message. And if you remember, if you set up from the previous video, we're using commitlint, which has all of these different subjects that are available to us to use in our commit message, and it will reject it if we don't use them. So this is a new feature. So I'm going to use feat colon implement search component. And it ran my linter automatically because of Husky, and my commit succeeded, and we're in great shape. We're ready to move on to the next components, the header and the footer. All right, we're gonna go a little bit faster with the header and footer here, just to keep the video from getting too long. So pretty quickly, I'm gonna look at what I need for a header and footer. I need basically just a flex element with some buttons in it. Footer, same thing, some buttons in it, but the footer has a different color. Footer is going to be stuck to the bottom, header stuck to the top. You could probably, aside from the background, it looks like they're pretty similar. You could probably get away with creating one component and just have a header variant and a footer variant. But typically, the header and footer in an app do tend to be significantly different enough to warrant creating two separate ones. So that's what I'm going to do in this scenario. So I'm going to create a new directory in components. I'm going to call it navigation. And then I'm going to have my header and footer in here. So I'm just going to copy as I always do, base template. And I'm going to need two. Paste it once, paste it again, rename the first one header, folder, lowercase, then header, 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 search in directory, replace base template with the word header, done, and we'll do the same for footer. Oh, not the template. Footer. Footer. Place base template in each of the files in that directory with footer. And finally, in the stories, I want navigation/footer and navigation/header. And once again, this here just matches how we categorize it in our components directory. So I close Storybook to do my commit, but story, start it up again. And I should find that I get navigation header and navigation footer, and it'll be my hello world base components. So refresh Storybook here, navigation footer, hello world, navigation header, hello world. We are ready to build. All right, let's begin with the header. So in the header, I would like it to be I'm going to copy my template here, and then I'll explain each piece of it. So one of the new things that we're going to learn from this component is Next.js's link component. So link is a special kind of tag. It's basically a souped up version of the anchor tag. The main difference for Next link is it's automatically connected to the router, so it will handle linking between different routes in your application without doing a full page refresh. So if you use the default A anchor tag in HTML and you link to different pages in your app, you're going to get a full refresh, and you're going to be a lot slower than if you use the link component with Next.js, which will let you navigate between pages and maintain your application state. So it's pretty critical that anything internal with Next.js, you always use the link component around the anchor tag. And you can find more information on that in Next documentation. So I'm going to paste here and I'm going to explain what each does. So I'm importing the link from Next link. I'm going to have my header interface. It doesn't have any of its own props, but it does use the default HTML header props, which will mean that whenever I use my header, if I want to put standard HTML props on top of my header component, then I can do that. That's where, you see here, take the header props and spread it onto my header. I'm going to extract the class name out of here in case I want to also be able to put Tailwind classes onto my component. So that'll add them here at the end after the default ones that I've put on. I want my header to be a full width of the screen, flex row, and I want to justify space between. So if you're familiar with flex, you know that one. Next, I have the first. So as you can see here, I've created two wrappers for items with space between them. So this here will be one element that's a child of the flex justify between, and the second one will be the other element. And if you look, you can see that I've got 2 links in the first and 3 links in the second. So what that should do is put justify between the 2 links and the 3 links and a button. And that, save that. What I'm trying to do is replicate the look of this. 2 links here with space between, 2 links and a button. I didn't bother with this little icon guy, but you can add that if you want. When I go and look at Storybook, I have an error. Could not find a story matching navigation header. Maybe I just need to. Oh, looks like I got an error. Oh, I just needed to refresh. There we are. 2 links, space between, 2 links, and a nice button. Got an error on my mock data here because I don't have any props anymore, so I need to delete that. Actually, if we didn't from our search, we probably need to do that as well. I check search mocks. Our search component does not take any props, so we should not be passing it any with our mock data. Back to the header. If you look, I've simply done hover. So a hover with a colon here will give you the like CSS hover, same kind of thing, and then you can put whatever styles you like on the other side of that. So only put a underline on hover for my links. And here for my sign in button, it's not the same styles as the button we created on the search component. So I've done it differently here. We've got a background 500 blue, rounded, and text white to match Google styles there. And the last interesting thing you might see here is if you look, I've actually hidden, by default, I've hidden these links, the one that say Gmail and images, and they only become display inline when you get to the small size screen. So what that means is on extra small or mobile, these should actually be hidden. Maybe they're not important, or maybe we have another menu where you can access them on mobile. So if I open up Storybook here, see this Gmail and images, and I change it down to small, we should still see them because they become inline on small. But on mobile, look, they've been moved away in order to fit these elements better. So that's a really nice, convenient thing that Tailwind lets you do with less syntax than the media max width media query of CSS. Okay, I'm pretty happy with our header there. Nothing else going on. You can see, just to show you the link component, same, you just need to make sure the href is on the link component. Everything else related to the anchor, you still use the anchor. All that goes down here on the anchor itself, but the actual linking logic needs to be done here on the link component. So what this will do is, I don't have my app open right now. I'm gonna open another. I'm going to open another terminal here, and I'm going to do yarn dev to load my app on port 3000. Not a bad idea. We haven't looked at the app in a while. And I'm probably not going to see it because I haven't actually loaded my header component into the page yet. So that's not a good example of that. We'll get that soon. But essentially what this will do is it will navigate to the home page without doing a full refresh. Okay, so that's the header component. Let's move on to the footer component. Boop. This one should be simpler. All I'm trying to do is replicate this here, down here. I think I've decided to just, they're kind of the same. I'm just going to do one of them. I'm just going to do the one that shows the country that you're in right now. So for the footer component, it's going to be simpler than the header, and it's just going to look like this. Same as before, we're going to extend the HTML footer props and spread them on the footer in case we want to use them. It's going to be full width, some padding, a slate background, and you can apply your own class names on top of it as well. And I've simply written Canada, hard-coded in there because that's what I've got down here. You can put your country or whatever text you like. Save that. Let's take a look at our footer component in Storybook. Hey, that looks enough like this down here. Not exactly the same hex color, but that's not a big deal. We're just trying to get a simplified prototype here. All right, so we've got those built. Let's look at the layout for the entire page. We've got the header component, the footer component. So we basically need to bring it all together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create a directory called, still within my components, I'm going to call it layouts. Oh, I've got one from last time. So basically what I just need to do is update my primary layout here. So this is left over from what we did in the last tutorial. I'm using Tailwind, so I'm going to get rid of my CSS module here. We're not using this anymore. And I'm going to paste my layout right here. So what does the layout look like? We've got head from Next. Head is a built-in component for Next. You'll want to look it up. It basically lets you add additional data and metadata to your HTML head. That's what I've done here is I've just set the title of my app, Next.js Fullstack template. You can call it Google search prototype or example if you like. And then I've imported my header and footer that I just created from their directories. So this is metadata. This will show up in like your browser tab. This isn't something that shows up in the actual page. The page itself, I'm using Tailwind to make sure the minimum height fits the screen. The reason I've done that is if we look at Google, see, I want, by default, it always fills up the whole screen. I'm going to want my footer at the bottom. I want it to be a flex column, and I want the items to be in the center. So looking here, header, space, items, all centered in the whole page, and then footer at the bottom. So that's the layout that I have here. I've got my header at the top. Next, in the main, I'm going to put the children. This is where I'm going to put things like the logo, the search bar that we made, and that little language toggle link. Next, I have an empty div with margin auto. So what this empty div does here, because it has a margin auto, is it's going to just fill up the rest of the space here at the bottom. There's lots of different ways you can do this, absolute positioning, sticky, things like that. But the reason that I've done it this way is I want, when the page actually grows, like when we use the search results page, I don't want the footer to be stickied to the bottom of the screen. I want it to be below the content, and then we scroll down to it. So doing it this way will allow that functionality. And then I have the footer underneath. So I'm going to save that. I no longer use a sidebar. I created that as an example in the last video, but we're not going to use that for our app. So I'm simply going to delete that. And finally, we are actually ready to test this layout with our application. So let's go to the pages directory. I've got an error, probably because I deleted the sidebar. All of this is left from the previous video. We showed how to use layouts, and I'm going to get rid of the sidebar layout. So it's just going to be the primary layout with the content of the page in between. This here being my page. So if I go back to primary layout, you can see that I placed children in the main in between the header and footer. So that's matches up back in my pages/index. That matches what's happening here. This is the children that's going to be inserted in the primary layout between the header and the footer. And this is the content of that page right here. This was our cat card example, which we're not using anymore. Once again, I'm going to go and simply delete this. You can keep it if you want to, but now that we've moved on to an actual app, we don't need our example card component anymore. That's going to start throwing errors that it doesn't exist. So goodbye, goodbye. And let's just start with a blank slate here. So what is the content going to look like? It's going to be our logo. It's going to be our search. And then it's going to be our toggle link. That's basically what we need to put in here. We already have that search bar, so that's easy. Search. Oh, that's not what I don't want to import for search stories. Getting a little carried away with the auto imports there. Our search component. And we need the logo and the language toggle. I'm just going to leave these texts here just to make sure that we have the right structure. So I'm going to save that, saying that it's compiled. And so if you don't have your dev server running already, what I had going there was just yarn dev. We'll run the dev server on port 3000. Open up my app. Now I'm testing the actual page, the actual layout in the actual app. So I don't want to use Storybook for this specifically. I actually want to check localhost 3000. And there we go. Look at that. There's the header up at the top here. This is where my logo is going to go. Search bar. And then look at this footer down at the bottom. It's starting to come together. So that's really great. And you can test your layout in Storybook by going to Layouts, Primary Layout, and you can see similarly we have our layout here. Storybook automatically puts a little bit of padding around your components by default. You can change that, I think, in your preview.js file. You can change the configuration to get rid of that if you like. And that's where our component is going to go. Component being logo, search, and language toggle. So let's move on to the logo and the language toggle on the main page. So back to our application here. I am going to introduce the Next.js image component. So import image. Now, I really recommend you go and read the documentation on this. The image component is surprisingly complicated. Maybe not too surprising because images in web development are a pretty complex topic. Talking about things like source sets, different qualities and sizes of images depending on the browser's screen size, maybe even their connection, all sorts of stuff. Basically, images are one of the biggest parts of serving a page. So there's a lot of work done into making sure you pick the right size and quality of image for the right user. So that's what the image component is designed to help you to do. And when you host your Next.js app, that's what is built into one of the things that the Next server does is handle image optimization for you. So big topic, really worth digging into. We're not going to get into it too much. What I am going to do is I'm just going to use the image component where the logo is and put it here. So because we're doing server-side rendering, Next requires us to explicitly say what the width and the height of the logo are. So I've simply taken these values from the actual size of the logo, Google PNG. And you're wondering, where did I get that? I went to Wikipedia, Google logo, and got it from there. And I took that file and I put it into our static assets directory for Next.js. By default, that is in public. So if you look here, oh, I haven't gone ahead and done that yet because I went back on a previous commit. So let's do that now. Let's go to, I'm already on Google. Wikipedia. Google logo. All right, so I saved that image as google.png and I put it in my public directory here. So I'm going to delete the stuff that I don't need, the cat from my previous video, and this for sale logo. So I've got google.png in my public directory, and then I can access it like so. Set the width and height, and priority means that this image, you can put this on one of your images on your page. Say your page has a lot of images, you can put the one that has priority, and Next will prioritize that one to get it rendered and served to the user as quickly as possible. So, you know, if your image is like your main logo or hero image or something at the top of the page, that would obviously have priority over images lower down on the page. So I'm going to save that. Let's do our language toggle. So our language toggle is going to toggle between English and French on our app. Now, we're not doing internationalization in this video, so this isn't something that's designed to work. But this is how, once you implemented that, this is how you would do it. So you can import the link and the locale. So where can you get the locale for your Next app? You can get that from the router. So I'm going to import Next router, use router from Next router, and then I'm going to extract the locale value from use router. Now, since we're using a router now on this page, that's something that we're going to need to consider for Storybook, because obviously Storybook doesn't have all of this Next image optimization and Next router built into it. So we're going to have to either mock those or ignore those, or basically just make sure we configure Storybook to handle them when we get to it. So I've got some text, Google offered in, and depending on whether my locale is English, then it's going to, if it's English, it'll make it French. Otherwise, it'll make it English. And text blue underline, Francais. Save that. Let's go and look at our page and see what it looks like now. Ooh, starting to look pretty good. We just don't have the styles applied for the layout of the page yet. So let's do that. So instead of that, I want to make the section into a flex item as a column, centering the items with a gap of 5 between them on the y-axis, a big margin on the top. So you know how Google's logo isn't stuck up against the header on the real site. It's a little bit down. And then get a top margin of 36. Oh, sorry, 36 on small and above. And then when by default on just extra small screens, we have a much smaller margin, so it's not pushing the logo down so much on mobile. So I'm gonna save that. There. Now you gotta be careful because it's starting to look so much like the real thing. I'm gonna get confused and think that it actually works. Still getting my hello alert. This is our app. This isn't the real thing. And you can see this is the big margin on top there. And if I switch it down to mobile, we should find that there, see? Goes up closer to the top, especially because your phone, your phone is going to have a smaller height. It's going to look something like that. Excellent. This is great. Responsive clone of Google site. So where do we go from here? I think we're ready to jump into the results. So let's talk about results. So our results component, when we say results, what are we talking about? We are talking about, let's go to the real app. We are talking about this. Link, title, text. Obviously, Google adds a lot of other stuff, and we're not going to worry about all of that. We're just making a very, very simple app. So I just want a component that looks like this, that I can reuse 100 times or 1,000 times that if I need to. So components, I'm going to call this a utility component. I'm going to copy my base template as usual. Paste it here. I'm going to call this, let's call this search result. rename search result, rename search result, rename search result, find in this folder, replace base template with search result, 17 occurrences, and always the last thing is to go in our stories and say, oh, utility slash search, oh, wrong spot. Getting ahead of myself here. Search result.stories is utilities slash search result. Let's take a look at Storybook. Refresh. Oh, utility. I called it different. There we go. Search result. And it's our Hello World Tailwind template. Great. Let's build our search result. So our search result is going to look like this. We're going to import link from NextLink because we're going to be linking to whatever the link is in the search results. And even if you're doing external link, it's still a good idea to use NextLink. This component is going to, unlike the other ones we built so far, this one's going to have props because we want it to be reusable, and we have an infinite number of possible combinations for search result. So what are the three things that we just looked at when we were looking at I closed it, but you remember the component had a link on the top, a title that was like big text and blue colored, and a description. So I've got, as props, the component will take a URL, a title, and text. And it will also take the default props of an HTML div element. So we extract the URL, title, and text here. This is a React functional component of type search result, as well as the class name, which comes from the div, and the div props, which comes from the div. Same structure, trying to be consistent here. Same structure as the other components that we built. Lets you put your own classes on top of it if you like, but by default, it's going to be a column. It's going to be 5/6 of the screen width. And the max possible width is going to be the size of our medium screen breakpoint. So it will be, if you're using an ultra wide screen, it's not going to be 5/6 the size of that. It's just going to max out at whatever our medium size breakpoint is. And it's going to have a gap of 1 between the three elements, which are going to be our URL, our title, and our text. So we have the link at the top. We can see the href is the URL, and then hovering over it will give you a pointer, an underline, and target blank means open in a new tab, and this means don't include refer info when you open the link. You can Google that if you want to know more about that. The text of it is going to be the URL, and then below that is also the title of it. And you'll notice that both these elements are wrapped by the link, and we did that intentionally because if you go to Google, it's not just the link and the results you can click on the title of it, and that also brings you to the link. And underneath, we simply have the text, and we haven't even put any styles on that. So we could save that. Now, because our component relies on props, we can't just go and look and test to see if it works, because it needs you to provide that URL, the title, and the text. So that's why I always bring this mock data along. I'm going to click on here. This doesn't match the properties that we created. See, if I do that, title, it's expecting title, text, and URL. So let's grab title, text, and URL, which I've pre-written in here. Oh. So it's going to take us to google.com. This is a link to a search result about a product or service. This is the topic about it. And then I've just written a whole bunch, to make sure that our component can handle the length of a long description. Our search result by default is already set up to take this mock prop base and apply it as the arguments on our base template. So when I save that and I go to Storybook, look at this. Remember, this is what we're trying to create. we're trying to create this link text. When you hover either the link or the text, you get a underline and a cursor, and then a description of it. So when I go back to Storybook, hover underline with the cursor and a description of it underneath. No matter how big, it doesn't stretch to the whole size of the screen. And on mobile, put it onto XS, it gets smaller in order to fit onto the screen. So I think we've got a pretty good search result component. We can save that and move on to the next thing. So we are ready for the final piece of our front end, which is going to be the look of the results page. So we've created the results component. Now we need a results page. And we don't have a backend yet, so we don't have actual results to query. So we're just going to use the mock data that we just created here to mock it out and make sure it looks the way that we want before we move into the backend. So I'm going to go to Pages, and I'm going to create a new file called results.tsx. And if you, I created a folder by accident. New file, results.tsx. If you remember how Next.js works by default, it handles routing for you. The name of your file in the pages will be equal to the name of your route. So I've just created a component that will render whenever I go to my app's URL /results. And there's two ways to do that. There's the way that I've done it with just the file, or you can create a folder called results and put an index.tsx file in that folder. Either option is perfectly good. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to follow the same structure as my homepage. I'm going to copy the homepage, index.tsx, paste it here in results, and I'm going to, and I'm just going to change this from home, all instances of home, to results. And if you don't know what I did there, highlight something and press Control-D in VS Code, and you can multi-select and type over top of all of them. So results, and it's going to use the same as the other one did, primary layout, but it's not going to have the Google logo, the search bar, and all that. We just want to have the results. So let's get rid of this. We'll keep this for now. Maybe it's not going to follow all the same rules as that one did, but we'll give it a try. And what I'm going to have is simply just copy this from here. And we replace that. So it's going to be a flex, item center, gap of Y5, and it's going to return, it's going to use my new search result component, search result props, and this might look a little tricky. Basically what I'm doing here is I'm creating an empty array with 6 elements. I just want to, doesn't matter what's in it, an array with 6 blank elements in it, and then I'm going to map that array. Again, doesn't matter what's inside the array. All I want is to return, I just want a quick way to return 6 copies of my search result component, and the props that I'm going to put on the search result component are the search result props base ones. So the mock data that I created here. I'm not using the locale on this page, so I'm going to delete that. I'm not using any of these things, so auto format should get rid of them for me. And let's take a look and see how that looks. So here's my app. I should be able to go to /results and load up. Hey, look at that. Looks pretty good. Yeah, I think I think we're good to go. Excellent. So we have now, let's kind of recap what we've got, because I think we're pretty much done the front end portion that we need to do. So before we get into the back end, we've got the main homepage with a search component that works, is functional with state, and is ready to go and send that search term anywhere that we like. We've got a results page that has the ability to show a bunch of different search results with mock data that we can replace later with data from our database. And we've got a layout that we've reused on both pages. So what we need to do now is we need to hook up our search component to a backend and have the results component actually display the data that we get from the backend. So because Next.js is a full stack solution that offers both handling of the front end and the back end, we can do both with Next without having to go and create a separate node server or use another language or anything like that. So it's really handy and really convenient. So, quickly, one little thing that I forgot here. These search results are supposed to be justified over to the left side as opposed to the center. So we need a variant of our layout. So I'm going to do that really quickly now. I'm going to go find our layout. So layouts, primary layout, and I'm going to adjust it so that it takes props to decide. See how we've got item center here? We want that for the main homepage, but we don't want that for the results page. We want them on the left, which would be, if you're familiar with Flexbox, that would be Flex Start. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a prop here that basically just, and I'm going to call it justify. You can call it whatever you like. And it's going to take one of two values. And it's going to be either, it's essentially going to replace this class here. And it matches up with Tailwind's version of those. Item center means that this layout will put the items in the center. Item start means the layout will put the items at the start. And it's optional because I'm going to have a default. So what I'm going to do is, here, in addition to the children here, I'm going to do forgot the comma there. Justify, and by default, it's going to equal center. So we don't even have to change our homepage. We only need to use this on the other one. And instead of explicitly saying item center here, I'm going to replace this with the value of the justify variable. So by default, it's going to be item center. So we haven't changed it, but it lets me set a justify property on my layout to items start. So save that. Let's go back to our results page because that's the one we want to change. And if we look at our layout, primary layout, put a space here. And as soon as I hit Control space, see I have this new justify property, enter, equals, and again, Control space, TypeScript does all this for me. Look at my two options, item start and item center. So for the primary layout on the results page, I would like them to be at the start. Save that, go and take a look at it, refresh the page, and there they are at the start. And I'm going to need to add a little bit of margin there as well. So let's do that on my primary layout. It's not really an issue for the main page, but it's needed for the results page. I'm going to say the main section where the children are has a X padding of 5. Save that. Look back at it, and there. Look at that. Beauty. Now we're ready to go on to the back end. So now we're ready to start talking about the back end. So similar to the front end, before I dive in and start coding like crazy, I want to talk a little bit about what the plan and what we're actually trying to do. So when working on the back end, I like to start with the data model, with the data, and work out from there. So what do we know about our data that we're working with? So the total scope of our app was we wanted to say that we want the ability to search for some data similar to Google and get back those results. And we've already decided what those results are going to look like. They include 3 things: URL, title, and text. So to keep things simple, to meet the needs of our app and whoever our client is, we've discussed all the different types of data that our app needs to fetch, and those are the only 3 things that we know of at this time. So that's how we're going to build our quote-unquote database. But in this example, our database is just going to be a JSON file. But we'll model it to keep it simple the same way that we've modeled our results component. So the database will store search results as an array, and those results will simply be URL, title, and text. Now, obviously, in the real world, your database model and your front-end model are not necessarily going to be the same thing. Very rarely they are, and that's the job of your API to fetch the data from your database, transform it into a model that fits how your front end wants to consume it, and send it to the front end. So we're going to skip the transformation part, and we're just going to model our database for simplicity after the same way that our components use it. So what I will do is I'm going to begin by creating, in the root directory, I'm going to create a new directory. So new folder, and I'm just going to call it lib. It's kind of a generic name. It represents like the library of functional aspects that our backend uses. Now, when you build like a larger backend, you're probably not going to have a single directory for that. You're going to have a whole bunch of directories, your models, your services, database stuff, authentication, like, you know, middleware, lots and lots and lots of different things. But for our use case, lib gets the job done pretty well. And if you remember when we set up Tailwind, we set it up so that it only processes files within the components and pages directory. Looking at tailwind.config.css, see, these are the only directories Tailwind's looking at. So it's nice. We could build out a gigantic lib directory with thousands and thousands of files, and we don't have to worry about losing efficiency on Tailwind's scanning, because it's not even looking at this. This is just for backend logic, and we're never going to have any components or classes in it. So within lib, I'm going to start with my database. So I'm going to create a folder for anything related to database things. It's likely only going to have one file in it, called database. And I'm going to create a file called, sorry, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. I want to create a directory in my lib folder that kind of encompasses everything related to search data. So that's, instead of database, I'm going to call it search, and everything related to search data, which is going to be our whole app, but everything related to that is going to go in here. So this is where I'm going to create database.json. And of course, I've already written out some data for this. This is just a JSON file. So remember, curlies and double quotes, nothing special about this, but it is a really good representation of exactly the shape of data that a real database is going to return with. Particularly the NoSQL databases. SQL databases might return in more like rows, and depending on the driver, I'm not going to go too deep into that. But in the end, once you're done your transformations, it's still going to look like JSON data. If you're working with Node and JavaScript, you're likely going to be working with JSON data. So this is a good model for it. So what I have here is an array with a total of 6 possible search pieces of search data inside my database. Each one of them has a URL, a title, and a text. And I've got stuff about cats, I've got stuff about dogs, I've got stuff about cats and dogs, I've got stuff about broccoli, and I've got stuff about cauliflower. So a bunch of different topics, and the reason I have these different things is I want to be able to test my search function and make sure it's finding the results that match with the search terms that I use. So I'm going to format and save that. This is my database. And now I need to write some functions that know how to query it. So where do we go from here? What I would like to do is I'm using TypeScript, so I'm going to need a model of the shape of this data so I know exactly how to work with it. And we've already actually created a model of this. We created it on the front end. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to create a file inside my search directory. I'm going to call it types. And this is going to be all types that are related to the concept of searching, which once again is our whole app is just about searching. So that's pretty much going to be it. And I'm going to jump back to my front end, and I'm going to find my search result component where I defined this here. And I'm going to take this and I'm going to kind of promote this from something that's only relevant to the search result to something that's relevant for my entire application. So it's going to be an interface, and I'm going to call it search data. And it's a convention to preempt your interfaces with a capital I. You don't have to, but it's a nice convention. So now I have an interface for search data that I can use anywhere in my app, including the front end. So because I deleted this from my component there, I'm going to go back. I haven't deleted it yet, but I am going to delete it rather than typing it out again, because if I changed or added any properties, then I would have to go and change this interface in 2 different places. Instead of doing that, I'm going to, now as far as I know, you can't extend 2 different types in TypeScript. So whenever I get here, I just change from an interface to a type, kind of 2 sides of the same coin there. I'm going to call it search result is equal to what it was before, the component props of the div, but it's also going to be my new search data component, or sorry, search data interface. So if I click through this, this is still URL, title, and text, and it doesn't have anything else, so I'll get rid of those. So search results, my search result component is a union of the type of search data that you receive as props, along with any component props that you could put on an HTML div. So that creates a single source of truth for URL, title, and text that I can use anywhere in my application. So that sets up our database. Let's talk about Next API routes. Similar to how they handle pages with routing, Next comes pre-configured with support for API routes. So the main difference between API routes and pages is that pages return React components, while API routes return data, most commonly JSON data, although it doesn't need to be. So you can see by default, oh, I've still got some auth stuff I was playing with before. I'll delete that. By default, Next comes with a directory called API in your pages directory. And you can then create API routes in here. And just like your regular pages, these ones will be accessible from your app by simply typing your app domain /API / in this case, it would be hello.ts. So if you're familiar with Node and Express, this should look pretty familiar to you, a request and a response. Next just has its own types that add a little bit of additional functionality to these. And you can return, here I've set the 200 status, and it simply returns JSON, name, and value. So let's go and test this. So if I go to my app and I do API /hello, I should get kind of a raw JSON payload with that data in it. There, name, John Doe. Excellent. So our API routes out of the box are working, but what does our API route here actually have to do? So here's what our goal is. We want to send something to our backend because we want to get search results. So our API route is going to need to be able to access the database somehow, whether that be directly or through a function in between or something like that. And what's it going to need to receive? It's going to receive the search term from the front end. Remember how we made the search term a state variable in our search component? That's the data that it's going to have to receive. So one really important thing to understand here is when we are working with API routes in Next.js, this data only exists on the server. So we can actually query, if we had a database, in this case it's going to be our JSON, but even if it was a real database, you can query the database directly in this handler function, and you will never expose that to the client. So you don't have to worry about exposing access credentials or database connection strings or things like that to the client, as long as you're using them in the handler. I mean, you do need to worry about it. You do need to be aware the difference between a page and an API route. You don't want to put a direct database call inside one of your pages, because then anyone on your client could just look at the source and the network request to get your database credentials. So you still need to make sure that you're only doing this in an API route or in a function called get server-side props that we'll talk about a bit later in the video. But that's just something that's really important to remember. Anything in your API routes is on the server side, and you can include database calls and things like that here. So what I am going to do is I'm going to copy this that I've set up here to get ready for searching. I'm going to rename this as search. So what I'll be doing is I'll be sending data to API/search from the front end. I'm going to paste it. It's going to be a bunch of stuff, but I'll go through it one line at a time. So first, I need to make sure that my imports are properly structured. Looks like I just went a little bit too far back with those. So I'm importing the types for an API request and an API response from Next. This is cool. I'm importing JSON data. And this is by default, TypeScript just knows how to do this. If you're using TypeScript, you can import directly from JSON and you will get a typed value out of there. So it's actually scanning the fields on my JSON data and giving it to me here. So if I do, remember it's an array, so if I do database at 0 dot, look, title, text, and URL, and that's not using the interface that I created at all. It's scanning my JSON file and getting these there. If I went and I changed this, one of them for some reason had URL, and I go back and look, see, it's now, oh, I'm not sure the data could have this or could have that. It's not consistent. So pretty cool. So I've got a type safe version of my database to read from, and I'm importing my search data interface that I created, the one with URL, title, and text. I'm going to expect on the request that I'm receiving, if you're hopefully talking about HTTP body and payload and things like that is a bit beyond the scope of this video. I presume you're basically familiar with it. If not, I recommend you look up HTTP request, what they call CRUD, create, read, update, delete for REST. Those are the terms that you want to look up and understand before continuing. On the body of our request, we're going to have a search term. You can never be sure exactly if the user is going to send data on the body, so we make it optional, and that's going to be a string. And the type of response is going to be an array of search data. Remember, we're sending a search term, and we want to respond with an array of search data. But it's not going to be, hopefully it's not going to be our entire database unless they just search for a blank term. What it's going to be is a filtered version of our database data filtered by the search term that they use. So let's get into the handler. I start by pulling the search term. This is just JavaScript object destructuring off the body, off the request. There's double destructuring going on here. So don't get too confused here. This is the same as saying const search term equals request.body.search term. Next, I'm going to check if the method is post. I'm expecting that the user, if they're using a search field and anytime you're sending data, you're using you're not using get, you're using post. So I expect the method to be post. I expect the search term to exist. I'm not going to respond with my entire database if they search for a blank term. And similarly, just to make sure that it's something defined, once I know that it exists, I want to make sure the length of the string is greater than 0. This is just some nice simple error checking before we go into processing the result, because we don't want to process someone's search term if it doesn't match our criteria. So Google search, massive topic, not going to get into it. Just text searching in general. If you do any kind of text searching, you want to be familiar with regular expressions. That also is a massive topic you can look up on your own. But the main reason that we want to use regular expressions for searching in text here, aside from efficiency, is because we want it to be case insensitive. If someone searches cats all in capital letters, we don't want to ignore results that have cats in small letters. We don't care about case when we're doing a Google search. We want it to be case insensitive. So doing that with regex means creating a new regular expression based on the search term, which is going to be whatever the user typed, I for case insensitive. If you really don't want to use regular expressions, you could do the same thing by saying like user search term dot to lowercase, and then check against the text from our database dot to lowercase. but that's going to be a lot less efficient than using a regex, but it'll work. So the filtered results, what we're actually going to send back to the user, is equal to our entire database. Again, we're not going for efficiency here. We're loading in our entire database every time the user searches. But nice thing is our database is hard coded to 6 items, so we know that it's not going to kill us. Then we're going to filter that. We're going to take the result from our database array, and we're going to return a check against our regex expression for the search term. So this is our search regex. We're going to test our database. This is going to go and filtering through each one of our database results. So that's each one of our this first, then this, and though each one of those results will have URL, title, and text on it. Where was my API route? Here it is. We're going to check our pattern, case-insensitive pattern, against the title or against the text of the result. So if, say the user search, again, let's say cats in all uppercase, it's going to search, do a case-insensitive search on the title in our database of each item and the text on our database in each item. And if it matches either one of those, then we're going to return the result. And the result of testing a regex is Boolean, as we can see here, true or false. So true means it will not filter it out, and false means that it will filter it out. And finally, when it's done, we're going to return the results of the database. And if any of these conditions isn't met, if they didn't use post, if they used an empty search term, yada, 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 we're going to return the same. I want to return the same shape of data because I want the front end, to keep it simple, I want the front end to be able to expect that we're going to get an array no matter what. But we are going to return a 400 status HTTP code, which if you look that up, that means bad request. So your request was bad, fix it and try again later. No results for you. So that is our API route, and we are ready to test it. So testing API routes. Ideally, we're working on the back end. We don't want to rely on the front. We don't want to have to go and create a component that does a fetch with it. Like, we don't want to put the whole app together just to test to make sure our backend API routes are working. So I'm not going to get too much into the topic of testing APIs, but I will briefly. How can we test to see if I can send a search term and get some results back? There's a few different options there. The simplest one, if you're good with Bash, is to use a built-in command tool called curl. GUI tools that are really popular. One is called Postman for doing REST requests. Another one is called Insomnia. Googling Insomnia or Postman within the context of REST requests, you'll find those tools easily. Another one that we can do, which is, I think what I'm going to do, is a really cool VS Code extension called, I've got a lot of VS Code extensions here, REST Client. So this will actually let you send REST requests inside of your app. And the nice thing about that is we can actually save those requests as REST files, so we can run those tests again later, or other developers that are working with us can run those REST tests as well. So I have this installed already, but if you don't, I recommend you install the REST client or use one of the other tools that I mentioned, or another one that I didn't even mention that you're familiar with. So let's do that now. So with that extension installed, right next to my API route, I'm going to create a file called search.rest. And I'm going to put the shape of a post request to that endpoint. So the HTTP method, post, the endpoint that we're trying to reach, it's going to be, make sure your server is running, obviously, localhost 3000 /API/search. See, /API/search. What version of HTTP we're using. This is where you can put your headers. So we're going to be sending JSON, and we're going to be accepting JSON back. Remember, it's an array of JSON. An array is still JSON. And this is where the body of our payload is going to be. Remember, the search term here has to match what we're taking off of the body. And then we're running it through our search database, and we're returning a filtered version of the results from that search term. So this is my request here. And with the, what what was it called? REST client extension installed. You can click on this file here and click send request here, and it will send. So I'm sending a search term of cats, and I'm expecting to receive JSON data back. And check this out. How cool is this? Look, I've got an array, and it's got 2 results, so not 6. So already that's a good sign. URL about, look, cats, and the second one. It's a link about both cats and dogs. So it returned the result that I have in my database about cats, but also the one that's about cats and dogs. And as you can see, look, I searched for capital letters, but it still matched against lowercase. What happens if I change this to broccoli? Save that, and I'm going to send that request. Look, what did I get back here? 1 result. This is a link about broccoli. That's great. Our search, we have a search engine and it's working. It's querying a JSON file, pretending it's a database, but that's fine. Let's change it to something else not found. I should get an empty array unless this exact text exists in our database, which I don't believe it does. There, empty array. Great. So let's just leave that as something like dog, leave it there so we can test it again later if we need to. Our API route is working. So now that we have our API working, let's query it from our results page. So this is where we get into the really important topic of dynamic versus statically rendered pages. So if I look at the Google homepage, or not the Google, I mean my tiny little attempt at replicating some of the features of the Google homepage, you can see that there's no props provided to home. So it doesn't need, the homepage when we go to it is going to look exactly the same for every single user. It doesn't matter who you are, the homepage is always going to look the same. So because of that, we can generate this as a static, what's called a static page. So a static page is basically just raw HTML and JavaScript that doesn't need to be generated every time a user requests it because it's always the same for every user. So that has the big benefit primarily of being much faster and much less server resources because you're not generating a different version of the page for every user. And we can actually see that in action. I know that this page is statically generated because I haven't gone and created a function that Next provides called get server-side props. As soon as you use the function called get server-side props, that tells Next, oh, this page needs to get some data before I can build it. And that data is going to depend and be different for every user that visits the page, it's going to be different data. So as soon as you do that, then you no longer have a static page, you have a dynamic page, which can still be super fast, but not as extremely fast and efficient as static pages. The great thing about Next.js is that it supports both, and it'll always default to a static page unless you need to create a dynamic one. So where I can actually see that this is the case is if I run a production build. So I'm going to run, I closed my my dev server for a second. I'm going to run yarn build to do a production build. I haven't done one in a while. Hopefully it works. Oh. My layout doesn't actually take a children component. Let's go and fix that. Primary layout here. This is an React 18 changed the type of FC to no longer explicitly provide children by default. Again, beyond the scope of this tutorial, but if you've been using FC and suddenly you're starting to get errors related to children, essentially what it's telling you is to say, you have to tell me if this React component takes children. And in this case, it does. So, and the default type of that is going to be a React node. Oh, import that from React. That's just a type of a React element. There. Let's try our production build again. Oh, see, this is where we're really checking all the types carefully. I created a footer and I changed the props there, and I didn't change my mock sample data. So these are good things to, good errors to see. Navigation footer, get rid of this sample data in my mock file. How about header while I'm here? Yeah, I already got rid of that one. Production build. Oh, okay, we're still Sidebar layout. Remember I deleted that component a while ago? Still importing it somewhere on the About page. You know what? The About page is a holdover from the previous tutorial, so I'm just going to delete the About page entirely. Production build again. Attempt number 4. Oh, didn't crash as quickly, or crash. It didn't error out on my types this time. Boom, done. Let's take a look at the results. See here? I can see on my pages this is my default root page, shows you the size of it. Green means small and efficient. API routes represented by this little lambda icon here. And another results page. And see how they have this little open circle here? If I scroll down, I'll see that open circle means statically generated HTML. When we switch and create a dynamic page, which is the next thing that we're going to do, you'll see that it's going to no longer tell me that that's a static page. So doing a production build will show you for each one of the pages in your app, the size of them and whether they're static or dynamic. So it's a really, really handy output to have. So I'm going to go back to running my dev server. And we're going to create our results page. So our results page is going to be a dynamic page. Now, why is it dynamic? Well, think about it. Search results, unlike the homepage, is going to be completely different for every user that visits it, depending on what term they're searching for. So we're going to need to have dynamic data to determine and show different search results for different users depending on their search term. So I'm going to go to my results page, which previously was just mock data in the search results, and we're going to get it all set up. So once again, we're going to have a really big, I'm going to dump a big paste here, and I'm going to explain it all line by line. Okay, this is our new results page. And, oh boy. I think in my original example, I had like a slightly different folder structure, which is why I'm getting all these errors, but I'll just do auto add all missing imports and we're back in business. Okay, so get server-side props from Next. This is the type of a special function called get server-side props. So this has to be named exactly as it's named. And this is a function that Next is going to call automatically every time that someone requests the results page. And I've created an interface to to describe the shape of the props that's going to be provided to my search results page on the front end. And that's going to be an array of search data. What is search data? That's the data, the shape of the data we created for the search results, an array of that. So get server-side props is going to return props in the shape of search results. So it's going to get the search results on the server that it requested and then generate the page for the user to see. So we're going to start with search results and assume that it is an empty array. We are going to get the search term from query.search. So what is query.search? Query is query parameters. In a URL, you have the question mark, x equals y, and foo equals bar, that kind of thing. Those are query parameters. So it's going to get a query parameter called search from the URL. So what does that mean? That means when I go to the search results page, it's going to look for something, query parameter, question mark, search equals dogs. This is where we're going to set the URL with after we're done creating our backend, we're going to hop back to the front end for a minute and have our search component set the URL with a query parameter that it will send to the backend. And this is where I get that search term from. Again, just as a sanity check, I want to make sure that it's not empty. It's not undefined and that it has a length. Otherwise, I won't even bother communicating to my API route. Might as well just immediately skip over and not do an unnecessary query. So what do we have here? We have the built-in fetch method with Node. I believe that is native now. Next.js does provide it automatically for older versions of Node, but I think as of like this week with Node 18, it is built in finally, which is nice. we are going to, this here, you'll notice, matches exactly the same structure as our REST file when we were testing our endpoint. The difference is it's JavaScript, so we have to stringify the JSON. We can't send JavaScript objects as a body payload. We have to turn them into strings first when we're making a request. And we're using application JSON, and we need to post. Remember, if we don't do post, our server's not going to respond. We specifically check to see that the method was post. Then, this is the response. It's going to await a response from my API route. Then it's going to await converting that buffer stream into JSON data, and that's going to be the search results. And then I'm going to return props. This is the shape that when you use get server-side props, it has to return props, and those props are going to be search results, which I've defined the shape of right here. See, if I try and do anything else or call it something different, I'm going to get an error saying, are you sure you didn't mean search results? Because that's being defined right there. Okay, so that is my get server-side props component, or sorry, not component, function that will get the search result data from the URL on every request, which will be different on every request. So this is a dynamic page. And now what does the results look like? Remember before we had mock data, but now we check to see if the search results is greater than 0. So remember, if we search for a blank term or we search for a bunch of stuff that isn't in the database, we're going to get back an empty array. So has results just tells us, is there actually more than 0 results? If so, we're going to take those search results and we're going to map them to our search result rendering component. And if there's no results at all, instead of just showing a blank screen, I'm going to say no results found. And that's it. So let's go to the results page. Oh, got an error there. What's this? Here. No results found because I didn't search for anything, right? Remember, what is this? What are we looking for? We're looking for a query parameter called search with a value in it. So what if I add question mark search equals dogs? Come on. Look at that. Dogs, cats and dogs. Do some broccoli search. Boom. We are querying our JSON database from our front end with URL params. And the really cool thing about this, putting it in the URL, we could just search directly from like our search bar component without going into the URL. That would be an option too. The really nice thing about putting it in the URL is now I can take this, I can copy this, and I can, share it with someone. Say, hey, friend, do you want to see the search results for broccoli? And give them that URL and hit enter, and they will immediately be taken to the search results for broccoli. So it's storing state of the application in the URL, which for a lot of things is what, you have to decide. It's kind of a domain logic and business decision. You don't want to store the state of everything in the URL, but there's certain things in apps where a user expects that the state of the URL can determine the state of the page. So this is really coming along well. What do we not have yet, though? See, I had to type in broccoli in the search bar. Remember, if I go to the home page and I type dogs, I haven't connected it yet. I still have that alert as a placeholder for the data. So essentially all I need to do is, instead of doing alert, I need to take that value, put it into a query parameter in the URL, and redirect to results with that as a query parameter in the URL. So let's do that. Okay, we're getting close. Let's jump back to our search component, specifically the component, not the whole page. All we need to do is get into the search utility /search component. This is where our alert search term was. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to I need access to the next router because I'm going to be navigating to a different page, the results page. So I'm going to import use router from next router, and I'm going to get the router from use router. Use router. And I am going to update, because inputs are always a string, even an empty string, I'm just going to update this undefined to an empty string there. Shouldn't impact much there. And this is what I am going to do. Instead of alerting the search term, I am going to use my router, and I'm going to push a new page state /results with the query param search equals the search term that the user has entered. And I'm not really going to build the functionality for this I'm feeling lucky button. They're both going to do the same thing. You can make it do something if you want. I think this video is more than long enough already. So whenever I submit this form, the default behavior of posting the form to your backend is not going to happen because we're handling that ourselves. It's going to navigate to the results page with the search term. And we've already confirmed that navigating to the results page with a query param does what we want it to do. So I should just be able to save that. Go back to my app. Localhost 3000 here. I'm going to search for cats. I'm going to click search. And nothing is good. Oh, sorry, I thought nothing. Just take a sec. Look at that. That's there. Search engine. Search is a real database on a real backend. Like, real database. It's a JSON file, but it's a real database. I think it probably meets a lot of the definitions. See, I can click these. All these just go to the same place. They just go back to the home page. But if I want to search for something else again, broccoli. And it's a form, so I should have, caked in accessibility and stuff like that. I should just be able to hit enter. Yeah. Here. Search result about broccoli. And because I didn't really get into it, but in the database, you see the URLs are real URLs to Wikipedia. So I should be able to click on that. Broccoli. Oh, I gotta, let's go here. I gotta learn more about cauliflower. Oh, 2 results? Why? I wonder why I get 2 results. Because look, broccoli, the description, broccoli was invented by crossing cauliflower with pea seeds. That's actually true, if you didn't know that. But it has the word cauliflower in it, so I also get the search result for broccoli. Check that out. This is a great app. Whoop, clicking on too many things. Yeah, back to the homepage. This is a full stack application. We're pretty much there. There's plenty of other things that we could do, but this is a pretty good ending point. There is one more pretty critical thing that I do want to talk about that's really important for understanding when dealing with Next.js apps, and that is maintaining state between page navigations. So like, say for example, there was something that I did here. This is going to be what I talk about, but like signing in, and then when I go to the results page, because I'm loading a new page, a totally new component, I'm on that page, I wouldn't necessarily be signed in anymore. So how do I maintain that state regardless of which page that I navigate to? So that's the last thing that we're going to talk about before we finish up. So I've got just 2 more topics that I really want to focus on or touch on this video. One is theming. We haven't got into theming yet with Tailwind, so I'll do that one really quick. And then the other one, as I mentioned, is persistent state between pages. So let's start with theming. So for theming, we have our tailwind.config.js file. Where is that? Down here. So you can see I've already started my theme. These different screens here. I'm not going to get too much into theming. Tailwind's documentation discusses it in way more detail than I ever could. I'll just show you a little example of a theme that I can use here. So in addition to screens, I've also set the default font family. I got this from I just went and inspected Google and see what font they use. It's Arial, pretty straightforward. So it should make our app look a little more like Google. You can also extend the theme. So what I've done here, remember when I said for the sign in button that it was blue? The blue in Tailwind is not quite the same blue that Google uses. So I actually went, Firefox in the DevTools has a built-in color picker. You can hover over and see the hex value of anything on the page. So I checked the hex value of Google sign-in button, and then I overrode blue 500 to be the exact hex color of Google sign-in button. And lastly, we can add additional values on to the end of some of the Tailwind's classes. So there's spacing classes, like width, for example, only by default goes up to 96. So I've defined a 128 here because a width of the default 96 for the search bar actually isn't really as wide as the real Google search bar is. So rather than explicitly saying like a pixel value or something, we want to stick with Tailwind. So I've created a spacer class or a property for 128 that I can use above the default top end of 96. And the great thing that I really love, this does require the Tailwind, wherever it is, Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin to be installed. But if you have that installed, now if I go to my search component, remember where we did width 96? Watch. So if I look at it, see it's only about the size of the buttons, but on the real Google, close all my copies of cauliflower on Wikipedia, it's quite a bit longer than the buttons, right? So watch this. Instead of W96, I'm going to say W hyphen, and I'm going to push Control Spacebar to get my autocomplete because of the IntelliSense extension. And look, it even reads from your theme. So even the custom properties that I've added, I can get autocompletion on, which is awesome. Tailwind's great. And then I go back, and this is the real one. Let's go to our app on localhost 3000. There, you see? Search bar is much wider now. So dive deeper into that. Lots and lots to do there, but setting, always best practice, almost always when working with design systems, is to set values on your theme and use them throughout your application rather than explicitly setting things or creating new things at the component level, right? Remember, we created the reusable button class, so that was one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is just putting as much as you can on your theme so that everything in your app, looks consistent and benefits from it. So very, very nice feature there. And now we come to the final topic: sharing state between pages. So I'm going to use the sign-in button. I'm going to create a really simple, obviously fake authentication process. In a future video, we can connect it to a real auth service. I recommend Next.js package. It's fantastic. You can do your own login, or you can use a single sign-on provider like Google or LinkedIn or Facebook or any of those login services, and it handles the majority of the hard work for you. It's a really, really great package. But what I am going to do now is I am going to start by creating a button that will help us maintain an authentication state. Even when we go from our homepage to our results page, it's still going to say that we're signed in and out. And I'm just going to make it so clicking the sign in button signs you in, clicking it again signs you out. So in components, I'm going to create a folder called buttons. And I am going to, as I always do, where's my component template? Copy that, paste it in buttons, do my thing. I'm going to call this auth button. So auth button. And even if I do a video in the future on Next.auth, I very likely will. This is going to be just a generic button that can be connected with any kind of auth service. So I still, even though I'm doing this as an example, I likely will use this button in the future for a real auth service. So And then I search in here and replace base template with auth button. And finally in my stories, buttons / auth button. Haven't looked at Storybook in a while. Let's jump back there. Refresh. There you go, auth button. It's my usual hello world template. We're ready to go. So let us create the auth button. So sorry, I'm getting a little bit ahead. Before we create the button, in order to share state between multiple different parts of your app, I'm not going to get into that either because there's a million different big full service packages that are designed for that specific purpose. You know, Redux, Recoil, MobX, however you pronounce that, Zustand. There's so many more. All of them are really designed to try give you different levels of interaction with your application state, and particularly in efficiently keeping components from re-rendering unnecessarily. But React itself comes in with a way of managing and accessing the state of your application from different places called context. So I'm not going to explain exactly how context works. I'm going to assume you're at least familiar with it. But if you've used it before, then you can see why it's something that we're going to need, because we're going to need to wrap our application with some kind of authentication context that our button can check against, regardless of what page it's on. If you're on the main page or the results page, it's still going to have the same authentication state. So I'm going to create another new folder in the root here, and I'm going to call it a new folder. Where's new folder? Why? Yeah, just use this quick button here. New folder. Let's call it context. And I'm going to create in here a folder called auth because it's the auth context. And then I'm just going to call it auth context.tsx. And I'm going to paste. So what I have here is I have create context and use state from React. I'm going to define the shape of this context. It's going to give us a yes or no, are we authenticated Boolean. And it's going to have a function that lets me log in. It's going to have a function that lets me log out. I'm defining a default value for that context. We're not logged in, and login and logout functions that don't do anything. I then create a variable called auth context, which creates a context using this shape here. Sorry, this shape here. Let's match up. And it uses the default value for that context. Then we have the context provider, which provides that value of state to everywhere in our app. It's probably going to give me an error on the FC with children again. Here, let's do this. Okay. But here we're going to, instead of using the default value, our provider is going to create an actual state value with React use state. Starts as false, but you can change it with the set authenticated function. The login will set your authenticated to true. Logout will set your authenticated to false. Very simple API there. And then this auth provider is a shorthand for your auth context provider with this state value in it. So we are exporting both the provider and the context itself. So hopefully you understand how that works. If you don't, I recommend looking up the React documentation on context. So jumping back to our button, auth button, is going to look like this. Just get rid of the default stuff there, paste it. As usual, we have so I'm importing use context from React. So we had create context before. Now we're using the context with our button, and I'm importing the auth context that we just created. So that's this right here from the file we just came from. CSS modules I'm not using. Get rid of that. Okay, so our auth button calls this hook, use context, which is our authentication context. So this will let our button consume the values that we created for authenticated, login, and logout. I have a button here which checks, are we authenticated? If we're authenticated, then it's going to, whenever you click it, you're going to log out. If you're not authenticated, when you click it, you're going to log in. So, toggle back and forth. Class name is just the colors that we used to match the Google styles. If you want to add additional props on the button, give you that ability. And what is the label on the button going to be? Again, depends on whether you're authenticated. If you're signed in, it's going to say sign out. If you're signed out, it's going to say sign in. And that's that. Now, what happens? So we've got this. We've got our story, right? Our mock data, obviously not sample prop. Our button doesn't take any props. What happens if I go on and look at the story now? I'm going to see the sign in button, and it doesn't do anything. Why not? And it would be the same as I've put it in the app, because we've used the context. Remember, when we make context, we create a provider of that context, and then a consumer. So we use the context. So we're using it with the button, but we haven't actually provided it anywhere. We created the component, but we didn't put it into our app or into our story. And in this case, we actually need it in both places, because we could put it into our app, but when we run these components in Storybook, our Storybook isn't loading our entire app. So we also have to put it in Storybook as well. So let's start with Storybook. I'm going to go up to Storybook. I'm going to go to Preview. We've already created, we didn't create decorators for this. Storybook uses, you can export a value called decorators, which lets you wrap the default story in any kind of components that you want. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to import our auth provider and have all stories by default get wrapped in that auth provider. So here, export const decorators, auth provider wraps your story. Auto format. I have to import this. Yeah, it's a JS file, so I'm not going to get the default imports. Let's see if I can find it this way. Import provider from /component. No, it wasn't components. It was context. Context /auth context. There we go. So I'm going to save that. My stories should refresh. Refresh it now. So now I'm wrapping all of my stories in an authentication provider. So when I click on this item, look, it works now. And I just have to do the same thing for my application. So let's go to our, now here's where, sort of getting to the real point of it. When we talked about how do you share state between multiple pages or potentially all pages in Next.js. So with Next.js, app is your entry point for all pages in your application. You can see that here is where we are calling the getLayout function and just returning whatever component is on that page. So what we want to do is wrap that component with our auth provider. So I'm going to say, so every page in our application, it's going to be wrapped in our auth provider. You can get the syntax right here. So that it can consume that context. And finally, remember our sign in button? Where was our sign in button? It's in our header. Let's navigate over to our header. Navigation, header. And instead of this sign in button, we can Get rid of him because we don't need him anymore. We want our real auth button. Save that. Let's go to our application. So I'm going to go to localhost 3000. I got a nice sign in button in the top right corner. Sign in. So I'm signed in here. Now, remember, state in Next requires you, even when you navigate pages, you have to use the router. You have to use Next link or the router hook. If you do a full page refresh, nothing that you do is going to maintain the state unless you're using one of those packages I mentioned that is designed to do that, typically by putting the state inside your browser's local storage. But we haven't done any of that. We're not going to do any of that with this tutorial. So you still need to make sure that when you're navigating between pages, you're not doing a full refresh. So if I was to do a full refresh right now, it's going to sign me out. Just hit the F5 button there. But watch, I sign in, and now I'm going to do a search for dogs, and it's going to navigate to a completely different page. Search result with dogs. Look, I'm still signed in. I've maintained that authentication state across 2 different pages. So yeah, pretty good. This app is a pretty good app. Does all kinds of stuff, and then I think it covers most of the really critically important topics in Next. Obviously, there's tons and tons more, but this really captures the fundamentals. I think, or I hope so. I hope you learned something. I really had a lot of fun building this app. I love Next.js, so I'd encourage you to keep working on this, or build your own app or whatever, using the concepts that you've learned here. And of course, like usual, feel free to leave a comment or feedback or whatever it is on the video, and like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff. And hope you enjoy your day. Have a great one. Bye-bye.